We have heard with our ears, O God, our fathers have told us the deeds you did in their days, in days of old. Hello, welcome back to Bethel Evangelical Free Church Hanley on YouTube. I'm Pastor Gervais Charmley, and in this video I'm continuing a little series on church history. And one of the questions that we should ask when we look at history is, and one of the questions that people do ask is, what books would you recommend? Now, I'm in this video obviously considering people who are interested in history, because if you're not, well, you're not. Although I would, and I have suggested and contended indeed, that Christians should be interested in history. But I'm thinking particularly in terms of books for people who are not perhaps up on the subject, who don't do a lot of reading, who want to know where to begin. So introductory works on church history, and obviously thinking particularly in terms of the whole church. One of the things to remember, of course, about church history is it's very long. Indeed, it can be traced back all the way through the scriptures, into the Old Testament, to the beginning, when men began to call upon the name of the Lord, as we read in the book of Genesis. But when we talk about church history, we tend to be thinking about the history of the church from the period really after the apostles to the present day. And a couple of books that I read as introductions in terms of the church history course that I took at seminary, and the first of these is quite an old volume. It has been updated, but this is my copy, which is, as I say, quite old. It's sort of mid 20th century, 1958 is this edition. It's A.M. Rennick, The Story of the Church. You can see it's a fairly slim volume. It's published by IVP. I don't know whether it's still in print in any edition, but it's certainly one you can find quite a lot of. And it's about 200 pages, a very basic introductory work, gives quite a good overview, and that's what you want in an introductory work. The other one is a very different kind of introductory work, but also introductory, and this is Sketches from Church History by S.M. Houghton. And this is a profusely illustrated work. You can see it has plenty of pictures, but it's not a work intended for children. As you can see, it also has quite a lot of text. Rather, it's a book that is designed to make church history enjoyable. It's something that's designed for people who want to get started with the subject. So again, Sketches from Church History, an illustrated account of 20 centuries of Christ's power, published by the Banner of Truth Trust, first published in 1980. So again, this is it's a late 20th century work. S.M. Houghton has been dead for many years now, but it's a good introductory, one expects. And on the whole, history, the thing about history is that it's very difficult to really assess the period in which you live. Who could, in the late 90s, have really assessed the late 90s? Here we are some decades later, a couple of decades later, and we can look and say, oh, we get some handle, this is what was happening then. But again, it's an excellent work. It's well written, well illustrated, and again, it's trying to do what every church history has to do. You've got to try to cover the world. Now, once again, it's a Reformed Protestant work, so it concentrates on Reformed Protestantism. It deals with something of the Lutherans. It's an English work. It's written in Britain, so there is a bias towards Britain. An American work would tend to be biased more towards America, although there is quite a lot on America in here. There we have New York and William Tennant's Log College. So there is the United States, there is Britain, there is material on continental Protestantism, a little bit on the other traditions. The next work, again talking introductory materials, is this one, B.K. Kuyper, The Church in History. This is published by Eerdmans. It's an American work. The first two are British. S.M. Houghton was English, and A.M. Rennick Scottish. So you have these two are British, this is American. And again, in some respects, it's really a sort of American version of Houghton. Written differently, it was intended as a textbook for students, for perhaps home education, for more advanced students. And so you've got things like timelines and maps that explain who we're talking about and when things were, because one of the reasons for having and reading a good introductory work on church history like these is that you want to get a chronology. I remember when I was doing history, when you do history in the school system in Britain, that it tends to be a matter of, here's a module on the Crusades, for example, or here's a module on the civil rights movement in America. And there wasn't this great effort to fit these things in to the timeline. It became even more confusing with the decision to try to talk about not just Britain and America, and not just Europe and America, but to talk about, for example, the Aztecs, and not necessarily connect these things together as to how do these cultures and the ancient Egyptians, how do these cultures fit together. So having some sort of timeline can be very, very useful. And maps, again, to know where were these people, what were these people doing. Of course, a lot of the illustrations, when it comes to the early church, you're looking at medieval and Renaissance and later reconstructions, so that you can have, for example, Ambrose rebuking Theodosius, and Ambrose would not have worn that outfit. But when you're looking at pictures of people in the early church, you're looking at artist impressions, you're looking at icons. It's not until we get really into the later medieval period, particularly the early modern period, that you start getting the idea of having really realistic images. And even then, when you're looking at images particularly of kings and rulers, they can be quite idealized. Photographs, of course, are rather different, but you can find these images that can be quite idealized as to, well, who is this person? Now, this again is from a Reformed point of view. R.B. Kuiper, I come from a Reformed point of view, so of course that's what I'll be talking about. But what we really want with a historian, what you want with a church history, is a historian who is committed to being accurate. This is why sectarian works that where the primary aim is to try to say, well, here we are, now who are our ancestors in terms of our particular confession? Sectarian works are usually fairly useless at this point, because they're all about really being an apologia, a defence of the sect. Well, we're not interested in defending sects, or we shouldn't be defending sects, but we're interested in what actually happened in history and who are the major players. And this brings me to the next volume in this, which is this volume. This is from IVP. It's Michael Reeves, Introducing Major Theologians from the Apostolic Fathers of the 20th Century. And this is history, this is theological history through the theologians. Now, this is a more... Well, it's not that these are lightweight works, but this is a slightly heavier work. It's not a very heavy work, but it takes us all the way from the Apostolic Fathers through to J.I. Packer, who, when this was written, was still alive. And it deals, not everyone in this book, and it's another thing we have to be very careful with, we don't just look at the people who are, well, they're our people. We look at people who we don't agree with as well, because we can learn from the people we don't agree with. And certainly none of us are going to agree completely with everybody. So the theologians here, we have the Apostolic Fathers, Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, Athanasius, Augustine, Anselm, Thomas Aquinas. These are the influential men. If you try to understand the Reformation, you've got to go back, because that's what the Reformers do. It's notable John Calvin and Martin Luther, both of them quote Augustine of Hippo again and again and again. Both of them appeal to the Church Fathers. They don't see themselves as being people who are junking everything that came before them and going all the way back to the apostles simply. They are in the great tradition. That's how they see themselves. And so you can't understand the Reformation, you can't understand Reformation theology apart from the Church Fathers. Obviously, when it comes into the Reformation era, you're looking at Martin Luther, John Calvin, and then John Owen, the great Puritan theologian. If you're looking for Puritan theologians, and you've just got to pick one, John Owen. Although in some ways he's quite unusual, because John Owen is a Congregationalist. Now, many of the Puritans were Presbyterians, but John Owen is the great atlas of nonconformity, atlas of independency, he was known. Jonathan Edwards says some very strange stuff sometimes, but again, he is very, very important for understanding American theology. And then we have two who were somewhat different. Schleiermacher. Now, Schleiermacher is the father of modern theology, the father of modernism. What happened to the church in the 19th century and the 20th century? Well, Schleiermacher happened, really. Karl Barth, and finally J.I. Packer. And all of these are influential people. They're not necessarily people that we should look up to and admire, but they're people who have an enormous effect upon the church. So that's Michael Reeves introducing major theologians. And finally, because I'm talking about introductory works, what happens if you want to go a bit deeper than the introductory works? Well, Nick Needham, N.R. Needham, 2,000 Years of Christ's Power. This is it's a fairly well presented work. Now, this is the old paperback edition. I got this in 2005. This is the 2002 paperback printing, and this is volume 1. At the moment it runs to 4 volumes, and this is what they look like today. This is volume 4 of the modern printing, the 2016 printing, first edition for the volume 4. But the other 3 volumes have also been printed in the same edition. And you can see it's a fairly decent typeface. There are some pictures, but it's mostly lots and lots of text, which is a good thing. And this is for those who want to go deeper, to get deeper into this. It's chronological. One of the things with Needham is he does try to go not only to look at Europe, and the focus of theology moves, the focus of the church moves over time. But he doesn't just look at Europe and the Middle East, the Mediterranean basin, but he tries to look at the Greek churches. When he's looking at the Reformation, he's looking also at the Counter-Reformation. It's necessary sometimes to concentrate. So, for example, this volume, this is, say, volume 4, the most recent. He begins, this is again the volume of the post-Reformation, begins with Germany and the Lutherans, goes on then to the Reform, that is the other church of the Reformation that aren't the Lutheran churches. The Puritan era in Europe, in England, because there is a distinction, a difference between the European Reformed churches and the English Reformed churches, and we don't want to miss that. It's not a difference that means that they're totally at odds with each other, but it's a difference. Some of it's cultural, some of it's to do with the settings, the different settings, different relationships of churches and states. The Puritan era, England, and then Scotland. Scotland, of course, is different again. England, you've got the Anglicans. Scotland, the Church of Scotland is Presbyterian. And then he has chapters on the Roman Catholic Church, because that still exists. And to sort of concentrate only on Protestantism is useful, but you miss the fact that Protestantism and Roman Catholicism are in contact with each other, particularly notably, of course, in places like France, but also in England and in Germany, that there is a conflict, that they're butting heads. And finally, a chapter on Eastern Orthodoxy, because again, that exists and it has to be taken into account. So this is somebody who, if you want to go deeper, then this is the book, really, this 4-volume set, at the moment. It's obviously planned that there will be more volumes. This is what you go deeper in. This will help in terms of a general introduction. After that, it's a matter of individual subjects, individual eras, individual locations, individual people. And as you can see behind me, there are so many books that can be found on individual people. Not all the people represented by the books here are people I agree with. And I think there's Dr. Pusey up there. But Dr. Pusey is so important to understand the English church in the 19th century and into the 20th century, because Pusey represents a very influential movement. But these are introductory works. These are the sort of books, first of all, these introductions, and then you've got Reeves, and then finally Needham. And Needham is bang up to date, pretty much. It's written, the author is a Baptist pastor who teaches at Highland Theological College in Dingwall, or did at the time this was published in 2016. This is material it's written by a Protestant, but a man who's tried very, very hard to understand the non-Protestants as well as the Protestants. So there we are. Those are my simple 15 minutes of, put that back, introductory works on church history and how to get started on the subject. Well, thank you for watching, and may God help us to appreciate that He is at work in history, and to enjoy reading, and most of all to read the best book of all, the Bible. May God bless you and keep you.